So I don't know about you, but August last year, I was following this incredible story of this paper in Marion that was experiencing a lot of attention because of a police raid. And many of us had the pleasure of watching, or the experience of watching, the trailer yesterday that outlines Eric Myers, who is the editor of the paper, his experience. And we now have the pleasure of having Eric here to tell us about it himself. So Eric, for those who may have missed the trailer, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your newspaper, the Marion County Record?
Well, those of you who saw it saw me in various forms of undress, so I'm wearing real clothes today. The Marion County Record is a 155-year-old newspaper in Marion, Kansas. I would characterize it as the typical local newspaper that used to be. That still is for those who are locally owned and locally run. My father had worked at it since 1948, and my mother too, and they were getting ready to retire in '98, and a group of newspapers offered a bunch of money to the people who owned the paper. And my family and I didn't like the idea that it would be sold to a chain, so 25 years ago, we went together, they and I, and bought it to keep it from being chain owned. It turns out we were right, because we've watched the chain that was going to buy it, and it's not one of the better ones these days. But we've owned it since '98. I, however, have not been there since COVID. I was working for 20 years at the Milwaukee Journal as an editor, did things like probably the only thing anybody's ever heard of, editor's work's never known. But I did cover a computer hacker case before there was the internet that helped inspire the movie War Games. So it goes way back to that. Then I moved from there after 2 decades to teach at the University of Illinois, and was one of the last people who got tenured and be a regular faculty member without some modifier in their title as a professor there. Spent another 20 years there, ran the online side of American Journalism Review, did consulting on online publishing and economics for businesses. And during COVID, I went home for spring break to visit my mother and got stuck there, and taught my classes from there for a couple of semesters, and decided online classes were the stupidest thing anyone had ever invented. And I was old enough to retire, so I retired. So now this is my retirement gig. My retirement hobby is putting out this little newspaper in Kansas. I don't even take a salary for it. So we'd originally planned to have it be employee-owned, but for a variety of reasons, the reporter went off and married somebody from Des Moines, and somebody, on and on. We didn't get it to be employee-owned, so I just have hung around and sort of taken over the paper. And it's a normal newspaper that has long been a bastion of, keeping local government in check. Years ago, a mayor gave my father, the editor, an award, a designation of public watchdog for the city and things of that nature. But it's been a successful paper over time and been a little politically connected. One of the former editors was governor of the state. Another one was a congressman and a Supreme Court justice for the state. So it's had some tradition.
Fabulous. So you became a touchstone for freedom of the press in August of 2023. Can you share with us what happened?
Well, the story, if I actually had time to tell it all, would go back 20 years before that. But the proximate cause was the city had a great turnover. The police chief, the city administrator, the assistant police chief, the city clerk, a variety of other people had either fired or been resigned. And the mayor had kind of taken over and started doing what he wanted to do. He hired a new police chief, which we learned had some problems behind him. He was coming from the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department, where he was making $120,000 a year as a captain, and decided 1 year before retirement to come to Marion, Kansas at $60,000 a year. We had learned from sources that this was because he had some bad encounters and was about to be demoted in Kansas City, but we couldn't get the police, the thin blue line, they wouldn't go on the record. We had multiple sources, but they all came from the same place. We couldn't tell the story in print. We didn't think we could, but we did warn the city council. City council told us, mind your own business, basically. Actually, literally mind your own business. They appointed him nonetheless, and this flashed forward to a thing that was an event from a congressman, new congressman in the area was going to have a meet and greet to which we'd been invited by the congressman. A restaurant owner in town had us evicted by the police chief on the grounds that we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. We were a little worried about that phrase and how it had been used in the past, but we didn't make much out of it because the congressman agreed afterward to come over to our office and be interviewed, and we got a better interview out of him than that, but we did report it. In response to that reporting, one of our readers sent us a document that said that the restaurant owner who was applying for a liquor license has been driving illegally for the past 20 years because she had a drunken driving case that she tried to divert, and she never finished the diversion agreement. Well, we were afraid of being Dan Rathered, so the first thing we did was try to verify the document. We had trouble doing it. She told us, well, it's publicly available on a website. Yeah, we went to the website. We couldn't find it. And we eventually called the state that operated the website and said, how did you get this freely available document? Oh, you press this thing that doesn't look like a button, and it's actually a button, and it gives it to you. So we did, and we verified that it was there, but we determined afterward from another source that the restaurant owner was in a divorce with her husband, her estranged husband, and that he was trying to get custody of all their vehicles because she couldn't drive, and that was why it had been leaked to us. So we decided we're not going to publish it. But there was this allegation that police had been aware of the fact that she'd been driving illegally for more than a decade. And so we wrote a note to the police chief and the sheriff saying, we've got this, we verified it, we aren't going to do anything about it, but here's what we know. If you have any questions for us, we'll be happy to help you. They never answered the note. 1 week later, they showed up in our newsroom and at my mother's home, which I shared with her, and the home of the vice mayor, who was a political enemy of the mayor, with search warrants, and searched for our computers to find out evidence of the fact that we had the document. Now, let's ignore the fact that the vice mayor, who also received a copy from the document from the same source, had actually sent the document to them, along with the name of who had supplied it to her. And it was the same person who had supplied it to us. And we had publicly admitted that we'd done this and we'd done this. We have later learned, and just actually this week learned in documents released by a special prosecutor's investigation, that 2 of the officers who prepared the search warrants also knew that we had obtained this from a legally available site with the help of the state and tried to tell their supervisors this, and they refused to listen. They also said that, aren't there some First Amendment concerns? And one of the guys said in his testimony to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, which was brought in as an independent group after the Kansas Bureau of Investigation was linked to this. I watched the movie The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and it was about the press, and the press is important, and should we really do this? And he was overruled by the sheriff and by the police chief. Anyway, they raided our office. It was sort of like coming at a jaywalker with a SWAT team. Except the jaywalker wasn't jaywalking.
Crosswalk.
Yeah, he was in the crosswalk, but they sent the SWAT team anyway.
Yeah.
2 weeks earlier, they'd raided the house of a suspected rapist, child rapist, who was known to have guns in the house. They'd sent 2 officers to that. Wow. To the newspaper and to my mother's house and to the vice mayor's house, they sent 7. There were 7 at one time in my mother's house. They spent 2.5 hours there. They seized all our computers that were used to produce the newspapers, seized all of our personal cell phones and laptops, took them all. They also made a copy of our hard drive, which they failed to put on their inventory till later. And we discovered only when they eventually returned the material. And then they wouldn't give us the hard drive. They had to destroy it. And so we have pieces of a hard drive in a plastic bag now. But they kept this material for roughly a week, which was a publication cycle for us. So we had to put out a paper. Nobody who is not involved in little community newspapers would understand this, but it was the first week of delinquent taxes, which is one of these 3 or 4 pages long legal notices that was in the paper. We'd published it, but we didn't have it anymore. We had to publish it for a second week, but they'd taken all of our computers. We didn't even have our nameplate. We had to go back and get it. So we managed to get a newspaper out, and then afterward they returned the computers to us after the county attorney said that he hadn't read the search warrant application. There was a complaint made about the magistrate judge, and she had done nothing wrong, the State Judicial Review Board said, but they advised her in the future to read things before she signs them. And it went on like that.
So just incredible, the intimidation tactics,
Well, and the sad part of it is what happened to my mother.
Yeah.
They were in my mother's house. She was 98 years old. She'd worked at the newspapers since the 50s or 60s. Still did. She was, most people don't have microfilm viewers in their living room. She did. She did the old-time memories column, 15 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever. She was still doing that at age 98. Now, she had some vision problems the last year of her life, and I had to read the stuff to her, and she would approve it. But she, up until 1 year before her death, she was doing all of it all by herself.
age 98.
At age 98.
Yeah.
She was sitting in her house, and the deputies stood there. They were there for 2 hours before the people came to take the computers, and they just watched her like a hawk. She became very, very upset about this. Compared their tactics to Nazi tactics. If you saw the video, you saw her objecting to it. The police later wanted to have her charged with interference with law enforcement and assault on a law enforcement officer for threatening them with her walker. Anyway, she was disconsolate about the whole thing after I finally got back home, having gone down to the newspaper office. And she spent most of the evening muttering, "Where are all the good people? Why do people allow things like this to happen? These are Hitler tactics." Yeah. She would not go to bed. She would not eat. She didn't eat all day. She sat up in the chair, and I tried to console her, and I said, this is bullies, and bullies tend to do one thing too many. That's their comeuppance. They get caught after they do the one thing too many. And her response to that was, "Yeah, but I won't be alive to see it." All the time that the police were in there, she kept telling them, "You're going to give me a heart attack, you're going to give me a stroke, I'm going to die, it's going to be murder, it's going to be your fault." She finally went to bed somewhere around 6:30 a.m. the next day, and I let her sleep till about noon, got her up a little after noon, and said, you really need to eat something. She had diabetes, and not eating for a day is a bad thing. And I said, "Do you want to eat in here? Do you want to eat out there?" She went to the restroom, came back, and she says, "I don't know, I don't feel too," and died. In the middle of that sentence of sudden cardiac arrest. The coroner came later and said the stress of the raid was clearly a contributing factor to her death.
Of course.
So the good people eventually did come, but she was right. They came after she died. We've had nothing but a huge response from the public to this, all over the place, all over the world. Maria Ressa, the Nobel Prize winner, we won an award named after her. She had been watching it in the Philippines. Just had a group of journalists from Kosovo come over from the State Department. They'd been watching it. I have a grad student who was working in Egypt, and we'd had a paper about press interference with freedom in Egypt. All of them said, this is something, we expect this to happen in Kosovo, we expect this to happen in the Philippines, we expect this to happen in Egypt, but we look to the United States as the place where this sort of stuff doesn't happen. And they were shocked that it had. And around the country, we heard from tens of thousands of people, all of whom, this was like a taboo to them, that someone had done something that was just so far beyond the scope of realm, or scope of what they expected, that it was terrible. And it was from both sides of the political spectrum. This was one of the few times that everybody in this country seemed to be united, but I was going through messages and they would say, "It's too bad this happened to you, it must have been those damn Democrats." And the next message literally was, "Too bad this happened to you, it must have been those damn Republicans." we went, because a lot of people subscribe to our paper because of this. We are the 122nd largest town in the state of Kansas, the 57th largest county. We now have the 8th largest paid circulation in the state. And the funny thing is, people are renewing their subscriptions. And the most commonly heard comment is, we used to have a newspaper in our town. Now we have something that is put out, but it isn't really a newspaper anymore. I just miss reading a real newspaper. So we've had people from Washington State, from New Hampshire, from Texas, from Ohio, writing it. They're following local issues. They're writing letters to the editor about local issues. It's amazing, and they're doing it because they say, I just like to have a real newspaper, and my hometown doesn't have one, so I'll take your town.
And I think this is really a tribute to you, Eric, and everything that you bring to the paper and to the experience and your commitment, which I really appreciate. You actually understood this larger context from the beginning and said, if we don't fight back and we don't win in fighting back, it's going to silence everybody.
Yeah, and legally there's all sorts of reasons for this. There's a doctrine in the law that allows you to have immunity from prosecution if things are not settled law. Mm-hmm. Settled law means there has to be a court case and there has to have been a ruling on it. And so there are laws, and they've been passed, they've been signed, but nobody's ever challenged them in court, so there's not settled law. So police officers, sheriffs, and so on can say, well, it isn't a settled law. I can't be expected to enforce it. I don't know that it's true. I think that's just complete BS. But as a result, we're not going to settle our cases. We have filed, I have filed on behalf of myself, my mother's estate, the newspaper, two of our reporters have filed, our office managers filed, and the vice mayor have filed all federal lawsuits against the city and county of Marion, and we're not going to settle them. We're going to wait till there's a ruling by the court so that nobody can use this qualified immunity defense again.
So I have two more questions for you.
Okay.
The first is, given the tragedy of this and the fact that so many people clearly knew that it was wrong, have you ever received an apology from anyone involved?
Not from anyone, not from any public official. In fact, we've received the reverse of an apology. I was walking out of a city council meeting the other night with a council member and one of our reporters, and I wasn't listening to what the council member and the reporter were talking about, but I heard him say to her, I'm really sorry, Phyllis, that this happened to you. And I turned to him at that point and said, you know, this is the first time anybody, any elected official has said that they're sorry that this happened, even that sorry that my mother died.
Yeah.
You know, they didn't say anything. And he very quickly says, oh, no, that wasn't what I was talking about. I was talking about something that happened to her when she was a kid. So they have intentionally refused to apologize, and they won't say anything about it either. But most of the people involved are still there. We had a file on the police chief who we hadn't published, and the officer who found it, clearly violating the terms of the search warrant, found it going through the desk of a reporter who hadn't even been there when we got the note for the other thing, found it and called the attention of the police chief to it. He's the one who wanted to have my mother arrested for interfering with police. He's also now the interim police chief in Marion, Kansas. The sheriff is still there. The investigator who didn't want to do it is still there. The officials are all still there, which is why one of our reporters couldn't stand working there anymore because of that and quit. And it's taken us close to a year. We finally have found somebody to replace her. And he's good, but he's also, 22 years old and just out of college, and she was 55 and had some experience behind it. But it's been a long path. We were setting up a new bookkeeping system, and our bookkeeper didn't get trained because of the influx of things. We had all these subscriptions come in. We don't have an e-commerce site. We have a service called Sherry. That's her name. She sits and types the individual credit card numbers into a little terminal.
Yeah.
When you get 3,000 subscriptions coming in that way, it takes a little time to do that. And so we've been way off on our bookkeeping and other things. Yeah. We just keep plugging through, though.
So Eric, I could talk to you all day, and I think this audience would love to listen to you all day. We do unfortunately have to wrap up. In this sort of last moment, you have a room full of committed funders who are very serious about the journalistic integrity and the importance of journalism. Is there anything you would like to leave as a parting thought with them?
I came to this paper because I was convinced that community newspapers still are economically viable. Now, metro newspapers, I'm not going to make that claim for. This was something I researched in college, and I wanted to prove, leaving my university job, that I can practice what I preach. And sure enough, before this raid happened, our ad revenue was up, our circulation revenue was up. There still is a market for this. The biggest challenge to community newspapers, small community newspapers, is the depopulation of rural areas. The fact that there are no locally owned businesses, so there's no advancement path for local kids to stay in a community. So what you have left in the community are not the best and brightest. It's the same phenomenon that happened to the central cities in the 50s and the 60s. You essentially have a brain drain out of them. And then they get seized control of by, well, very much populist type causes. And you can see the results of that, not just in rural areas, but nationwide. This is a serious challenge. But the notion, the industry has responded too much that this is a challenge of technology. Now, would it be much better if what I call anti-social media did not exist? Yes. And I think it shouldn't. I think it's a danger to democracy, but that's another story for another time. But what really needs to happen is we need to get back to the strength of the rural areas, because they still have power. They still exert power. They may exert power that we don't want them to exert. And the areas itself are not necessarily as mindlessly redneck as people think they are. My area of Kansas is a moderate Republican area, back when there were moderate Republicans. But now it's been controlled in such a way so that it's all this sort of neoconservative type, very, very social motivated stuff, which never used to be the entering in there. But there's no control. There's no opposition on the election ballot. We're having an election. There's nobody opposed because nobody can get through the primaries. There are no Democrats there, so not enough to elect anybody. So the Democrats never run anybody. The Republicans, to get through the primary, have to follow this litmus test. Kansas voted to preserve reproductive freedom rights. The state of Kansas. But you can't get elected to anything unless you're pro-life, because the party structure controls that. The party structure is run by a person who also runs something called the Proud Patriots for Liberty. She goes to the meetings with a gun strapped on her hip. She's very anti-abortion, and she's made sure that all of the precinct committeemen are members of her group. And every county officer that we have was put in to fill a vacancy selected by the precinct committeemen of the party. So they have complete control of the structure of the county. That's a danger. Now, I don't know how we address it. I would love to say that we need to have ability for people to go out, people who care about their community, to purchase from the generation that's selling it their local newspaper and get the training necessary to be able to operate it. There are people who want to do that. The problem is they don't have the capital. And the banks won't give it to them because everything's about the stock market, and the local residents won't give it to them because everything's about the stock market. They can make more money investing in some money market fund than they can in a local business. That's where we are, and it's both a training problem and a capital problem.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you.
It's been a privilege to talk with you.